The sun hung like a brass coin against the endless Kansas sky, its merciless heat pressing down on the parched earth of the Henderson homestead. Sarah Henderson knelt beside the stone-ringed well that had sustained her family for 7 years, her calloused hands gripping the frayed rope that descended into darkness. She pulled with desperate strength, muscles straining against hope, but the bucket that emerged held nothing but dust and broken dreams. At 32, Sarah had weathered more storms than most women twice her age. The prairie wind had carved lines around her green eyes, and the endless work of frontier life had stolen the softness from her hands, but it hadn't touched the stubborn set of her jaw or the fire in her spirit. Her husband Thomas had been gone 3 months now, taken by a fever that swept through the territory like wildfire, leaving her alone with their 8-year-old son Michael and their struggling farm. The boy emerged from the modest sod house, his bare feet stirring up small clouds of dust with each step. His father's eyes looked out from a face too thin for his age, marked by the premature gravity that comes to children who've seen too much sorrow too soon. "Mama," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of understanding beyond his years. "Is the well really gone?" Sarah rose slowly, brushing the dirt from her worn calico dress, and placed a gentle hand on her son's shoulder. The fabric was faded from countless washings, patched in 3 places, but clean and carefully mended. It was all she had left of her wedding dress, cut down and remade for practical use. "Sometimes, Michael, when the Lord closes one door, He opens another. We just have to have faith to look for it." But even as she spoke the words her mother had whispered to her during countless childhood disappointments, Sarah felt the cold grip of fear settling in her chest. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and the town of Cedar Falls lay 20 miles beyond that across unforgiving terrain. Without water, they had perhaps 3 days before they would be forced to abandon everything Thomas had built with his own 2 hands. The homestead stretched before them in all directions. 160 acres claimed under the Homestead Act, every furrow plowed with blood, sweat, and dreams. The corn had withered to brown stalks that rustled like old bones in the wind, and the vegetable garden that had once been Sarah's pride lay cracked and barren. Only the old oak tree near the house still offered shade, its roots reaching deep enough to find the last traces of moisture in the earth. As if summoned by her desperation, a figure appeared on the horizon, wavering like a mirage in the heat. Sarah shaded her eyes with her hand, squinting against the glare, as the shape slowly resolved into a man on horseback leading a pack mule. Her heart hammered against her ribs as old instincts awakened. In this territory, strangers could bring salvation or disaster in equal measure, and a woman alone had learned to prepare for both. The rider approached with the unhurried pace of a man who had learned to read the land and its moods. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding with intelligent eyes, picked its way carefully across the uneven ground, while the pack mule followed with the patient resignation of an animal accustomed to long journeys. As he drew closer, Sarah could see that he was tall and lean, with the easy posture of someone equally comfortable in the saddle or on foot. He pulled rein 20 feet from the well, close enough to speak but far enough to show respect for a woman's caution. His hat was pulled low against the sun, but she could see weathered features marked by years of outdoor work, and eyes the color of winter sky. A week's growth of beard covered his jaw, and dust from countless miles coated his clothes, but there was something in his manner that spoke of gentle breeding beneath the rough exterior. "Morning, ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture as natural as breathing. His voice carried the slight drawl of Texas, warm as honey, and just as smooth. "Name's Jake Morrison. I was wondering if I might trouble you for some water for my animals. Been riding since before dawn, and they're mighty thirsty." Sarah felt Michael press closer to her side, and she rested her hand protectively on his shoulder. The irony of the request would have been laughable if it weren't so heartbreaking. "I'm afraid our well has run dry, Mr. Morrison. I'm sorry I can't help you." Jake's expression shifted, and she saw genuine concern replace polite courtesy. He swung down from his saddle with fluid grace, his boots hitting the packed earth with barely a sound. "Forgive me, ma'am, but you look like you've been having a hard time of it. When did the well go dry?" "This morning," Sarah admitted, surprised by her own honesty. Something in his manner invited trust, though she couldn't have said what it was. Perhaps it was the way he stood with his hands visible, making no sudden movements, or the gentle way he spoke to his horse as he loosened the cinch. "My husband always said it would happen someday. The water table's been dropping for years." Jake nodded thoughtfully, walking over to peer down into the stone-lined shaft. He picked up a small rock and dropped it, counting under his breath until the faint sound echoed back from below. 22 feet to bottom, he murmured, then looked up at Sarah with something like hope in his eyes. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, how long has it been since your husband passed? The directness of the question should have offended her, but somehow it didn't. Perhaps it was because she could see no calculation in his face, no predatory interest, only gentle concern and something that might have been recognition of shared sorrow. 3 months, she said quietly. And you've been managing this place alone since then? When she nodded, he whistled softly. That takes considerable courage, ma'am. Most folks would have packed up and headed back east by now. This is my son's inheritance, Sarah said firmly, her chin lifting with the stubborn pride that had carried her through the worst of times. His father died believing this land would provide for us. I won't abandon that dream without a fight. Jake studied her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling feeling that he could see straight through to her soul. Ma'am, I've spent the better part of 10 years digging wells across 3 territories. If you'll permit me, I'd like to take a look around, see if there might be another source of water on your property. Sarah stared at him in disbelief, her heart suddenly beating so fast she could barely breathe. You're a well digger? Among other things, Jake said with a slight smile that transformed his entire face. I've got experience with irrigation, land management, and finding water where other folks think there isn't any. Sometimes the good Lord puts us exactly where we need to be, even when we don't understand his plan. Michael tugged at his mother's skirt, his young voice bright with the first hope she'd heard from him in weeks. Mama, maybe God sent him to help us, just like in the Bible stories you tell me. Jake knelt down to the boy's level, his expression serious and respectful. What's your name, son? Michael Henderson, sir. This is my mama, Mrs. Sarah Henderson. It's an honor to meet you both, Jake said solemnly, extending his hand to the boy. Would you like to help me look for water signs while your mama considers my offer? Sarah watched her son's face light up with the first genuine joy she'd seen since his father's death, and felt something crack open in her chest. Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your kindness, but I have to be honest with you. We don't have money to pay for well-digging services. Jake rose slowly, dusting off his knees. Who said anything about payment, ma'am? I've got supplies, tools, and time. What I don't have is a good reason to be anywhere else in particular. Sometimes a man's got to earn his keep through service rather than coin. I couldn't possibly accept such generosity from a stranger, Sarah protested, even as hope warred with pride in her heart. Then don't think of me as a stranger, Jake said simply. Think of me as a neighbor who happens to be passing through with the right skills at the right time. Besides, he added with a grin that made him look years younger, I've got a powerful thirst, and if I can find water here, it'll solve my problem too. Sarah looked around at the dying land that represented everything she and Thomas had worked for, then down at her son's eager face, and felt the last of her resistance crumble. All right, Mr. Morrison. If you're determined to help, I won't stand in your way, but I insist on feeding you and providing whatever other hospitality I can manage. Fair enough, Jake said, extending his hand to shake hers. His grip was firm and calloused, the handshake of a man accustomed to honest work. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to walk your property and get a feel for the lay of the land. Michael, would you like to come along and learn how to read water signs? The boy nodded eagerly, and Sarah watched the two of them set off across the parched fields, Jake pointing out subtle features of the landscape, while Michael peppered him with questions. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things might work out after all. But as she turned back toward the house to prepare whatever poor meal she could manage from their dwindling supplies, she caught herself wondering about Jake Morrison's story. What brought a skilled well digger to her remote corner of Kansas with no apparent destination in mind? And why was he so willing to help strangers without expectation of reward? In her experience, such generosity usually came with a price that wasn't immediately apparent. Jake and Michael returned an hour later with dirt under their fingernails and excitement in their voices. Sarah had managed to prepare a simple meal of cornbread, beans, and coffee, stretching their meager supplies as far as possible. She watched Jake wash his hands at the pump behind the house, noting the careful, methodical way he cleaned each finger, the respect he showed for the precious water. Well? She asked as they gathered around the rough-hewn table Thomas had built during their first winter. Your husband was a smart man, Jake said, accepting the plate she offered with genuine gratitude. He picked good land, with proper drainage and a southern exposure. The problem is that the original well was dug in the easiest spot, not necessarily the best one. Michael bounced in his chair with barely contained excitement. Tell her about the willows, Mr. Morrison. Jake smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. There's a line of young willow trees about a quarter-mile north of here, following what looks like an old creek bed. Willows are water seekers. Their roots can reach down 40 feet or more to find moisture. I'm betting there's an underground stream running through there, probably fed by springs in the hills to the west. You really think we can find water? Sarah asked, afraid to hope too much. I've seen all the signs I need to see, Jake said confidently. The question is whether you're prepared for the work it'll take. Digging a well is backbreaking labor, especially when you're going deep. Could take us 2 weeks, maybe more. Us? Sarah repeated. Well, I can't do it alone, and Michael's eager to help, aren't you, son? Jake winked at the boy, who nodded vigorously. Besides, it's your land. You should have a hand in bringing it back to life. As they ate, Jake told them stories of wells he'd dug across the frontier, each one a small victory against the harsh realities of life on the plains. He spoke of families he'd helped, communities that had thrived after finding reliable water sources, and the deep satisfaction that came from coaxing life from seemingly barren ground. What made you choose this work? Sarah asked, genuinely curious. Jake's expression grew thoughtful as he stared out the window at the dying fields. My family had a ranch down in Texas before the war. My father was a good man, but he never understood that water was more precious than cattle or land or anything else out here. We lost everything during a drought year because he refused to invest in proper wells. He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. I swore I'd never let that happen to anyone else if I had the power to prevent it. What happened to your family? Michael asked with the innocent curiosity of childhood. Michael, Sarah said gently. That's not a polite question. It's all right, Jake said quietly. My parents died of fever that same year, and my younger sister, well, she went back east to live with relatives. Haven't seen her in 5 years now. He looked up with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. But that's ancient history. The important thing is that we've got work to do and plenty of daylight left to do it in. After the meal, Jake unpacked his tools with the careful attention of a craftsman. Sarah watched in fascination as he laid out hand-forged picks, shovels designed specifically for well digging, wooden buckets bound with iron, and a curious contraption he called a well point. Each tool showed signs of heavy use but had been maintained with obvious care. Tomorrow we'll start digging, he announced. But tonight, I'd like to make camp by that old oak if you don't mind. I prefer sleeping under the stars when the weather's fair. Nonsense, Sarah said firmly. There's a spare room in the house. It's not much, but it's better than the ground. Jake hesitated, and she realized he was trying to protect her reputation as much as respect her hospitality. Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but people talk, and a widow woman has to be careful about appearances. The nearest neighbor is 15 miles away, Sarah pointed out practically. And anyone who would think ill of me for offering shelter to the man trying to save my farm isn't worth worrying about. The next morning dawned clear and already warm, promising another scorching day. Sarah woke before sunrise as was her habit, but when she looked out the kitchen window, she saw that Jake was already up, checking his tools and studying the lay of the land in the early light. Michael had apparently risen early as well and was following the man around like an eager puppy. She prepared a hearty breakfast of flapjacks and bacon, using some of their precious remaining supplies. When she called them in to eat, she noticed that Jake had already marked out a rectangular area near the willow trees with stakes and string. That's where we'll dig? She asked. That's the spot, Jake confirmed. The ground's got a different feel there, softer, with more moisture. And see how the grass is just a shade greener in that area? It's subtle, but if you know what to look for, the signs are clear. They began digging after breakfast, with Jake wielding the pick to break up the packed earth while Sarah and Michael took turns with shovels to clear away the loose soil. The work was exhausting in the growing heat, but there was something deeply satisfying about it too. Each shovelful of dirt brought them closer to their goal, and Jake's quiet confidence was infectious. By midday, they had dug down nearly 4 feet, and the earth was beginning to show signs of moisture. Jake called for a rest, and they retreated to the shade of the oak tree to eat cold cornbread and drink lukewarm water from their dwindling supply. Tell me about your husband, Jake said quietly, settling back against the tree trunk. What kind of man was he? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching Michael play with a collection of interesting rocks he'd found during the digging. Thomas was steady, she finally said. Not the most exciting man in the world, but reliable, kind. He loved this land almost as much as he loved us, and he worked himself nearly to death trying to make it prosper. Sounds like a good man. He was. Sarah's voice grew soft with memory. He used to say that the land would provide for those who treated it with respect. Even when the crops failed or the weather turned against us, he never lost faith. I think that's what I'm trying to honor by staying here. His faith in this place. Jake nodded slowly. Faith's important, but sometimes it needs to be paired with the right knowledge and tools. Your husband's faith is what brought this place to life in the first place. Now we're just helping it along a little. They returned to work in the afternoon, and by evening, they had reached 6 feet. The soil was noticeably damper now, dark and rich-looking, instead of the dusty brown of the surface. Jake examined each shovelful carefully, sometimes tasting the dirt or rolling it between his fingers. We're getting close, he announced as they climbed out of the hole for the day. I'd say another few feet and we'll hit the water table. That evening, Sarah prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread, and they ate by lamplight as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Michael had fallen asleep at the table, exhausted by the unaccustomed physical labor, and Jake gently carried him to his bed. When he returned, Sarah was cleaning the dishes with water heated over the fire. He's a good boy, Jake said quietly. You've raised him well. His father's influence, Sarah replied. Thomas always said that hard work and kindness were the only things worth passing on to the next generation. Wise man. Jake picked up a dish towel and began drying the plates without being asked. Sarah, can I ask you something? The use of her first name should have felt presumptuous, but somehow it didn't. Of course. What will you do if we find water? I mean, in the long term. This is a big spread for a woman and boy to manage alone. Sarah set down the plate she'd been washing and stared out the window at the darkness beyond. It was a question that had kept her awake many nights, gnawing at her like a physical pain. I don't know, she admitted. Thomas always handled the heavy work, the planning, dealing with buyers for the crops. I can cook and garden and take care of the animals, but I've never run a farm by myself. You've been doing it for 3 months, Jake pointed out gently. I've been surviving for 3 months, Sarah corrected. That's not the same thing. If we find water, if the crops can be saved, I'll need help with the harvest, with getting the produce to market, with a dozen things I don't know how to do. Jake was quiet for a long moment, and when she looked at him, she saw something uncertain in his expression, as if he were wrestling with a decision. Sarah, he said finally, what would you say if I offered to stay on and help? Not as charity, he added quickly, but as a partner. I know farming as well as I know well digging, and this land. It has good bones. With the right care, it could be really prosperous. Sarah's hands stilled on the dish she'd been washing, her heart suddenly pounding so hard she was certain Jake could hear it. A partner? She repeated carefully. I'm not talking about anything improper, Jake said quickly, his cheeks coloring slightly in the lamplight. I mean a business arrangement. I help you run the farm, make it profitable again, and we split the proceeds. You keep ownership of the land, of course, but I'd contribute my labor and expertise. Sarah dried her hands slowly on her apron, buying time to think. The offer was more than generous. It was the answer to prayers she'd been afraid to voice. But it also frightened her in ways she didn't fully understand. Why would you want to do that? You could homestead your own land, start fresh somewhere. Jake leaned back against the kitchen counter, his expression serious. I've been drifting for 5 years, Sarah, moving from job to job, town to town, never putting down roots. I'm tired of it. And this place? It feels like somewhere a man could build something lasting. You barely know us. I know enough. His voice was soft but certain. I know you're brave enough to stay and fight for what's yours when most people would have given up. I know you're raising your son to be honorable and hardworking. I know you've managed to keep this place together through sheer determination when everything was stacked against you. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. Sarah felt tears threatening and turned away to hide them. It had been so long since anyone had seen strength in her instead of just stubborn foolishness. People would talk, she said practically. A single woman and an unmarried man, working together. There would be gossip. People always talk, Jake said with a slight smile in his voice. The question is whether you're going to let their opinions govern your life. She turned back to face him, studying his expression in the soft light. "What aren't you telling me, Jake Morrison? What brought you to my door at exactly the right moment with exactly the skills I needed?" Jake was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I had a wife once, Anna. We were married just 6 months when she took sick with pneumonia. The doctor said she needed to get to a warmer, drier climate, but we didn't have the money for the journey. I was working on a ranch then, earning barely enough to keep us fed." Sarah's heart clenched at the pain in his voice, but she remained silent, sensing there was more to the story. "I took a job digging wells because it paid better, planning to save enough for Anna's treatment. But the work kept me away from home for weeks at a time, and she got worse while I was gone. By the time I made it back, she was already in the ground." His voice broke slightly. "She died alone because I was off trying to earn money to save her." "Oh, Jake," Sarah breathed, instinctively reaching out to touch his arm. "I've been running from that guilt ever since," he continued, "telling myself I was helping other families, making sure they had water when they needed it. But the truth is, I was just afraid to care about anyone enough to stay in one place." He looked up at her with eyes bright with unshed tears. "When I saw you and Michael today, saw how you were fighting to hold on to your dreams despite everything stacked against you, it reminded me that some things are worth the risk of staying." Sarah felt her own tears spilling over now. "I'm scared, Jake. I've been alone for so long, and I don't know if I remember how to trust someone else with the things that matter most to me." "I'm scared too," he admitted. "But maybe we can figure it out together." They stood there in the quiet kitchen, two wounded souls recognizing something precious in each other, while the lamplight flickered and cast dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, a night bird called across the prairie, its song lonely and beautiful in the darkness. "All right," Sarah said finally. "We'll try it. A partnership, but there have to be rules, boundaries, for Michael's sake as much as ours." "Of course," Jake agreed immediately. "Whatever makes you comfortable, and we see how it goes through harvest season. If it's not working, if there are problems, then I'll move on. No hard feelings." Jake finished. "But Sarah, I have a good feeling about this." The next morning brought renewed energy to their digging efforts. They had reached 8 feet when Jake's pick struck something hard. He knelt down carefully and brushed away the soil, revealing a layer of smooth stones. "This is it," he said with quiet excitement. "The old creek bed. The water's just below this stone layer." They worked more carefully now, removing the stones piece by piece and setting them aside for lining the well. As they dug deeper, the ground became increasingly muddy, and then, suddenly, Jake's shovel hit water. It was a moment Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. The sound of metal hitting liquid instead of earth, the way Jake's face lit up with triumph, the way Michael whooped with joy from the surface above them. Water began seeping into the hole, slowly at first, then more rapidly as it found its level. By evening, they had a well 4 feet deep in clear, sweet water. Jake rigged a temporary pump system and brought up bucket after bucket of the precious liquid, more than Sarah had seen in months. They tested it first on the kitchen garden, watching in amazement as the parched earth drank deeply and seemed to sigh with relief. "It's going to work," Sarah whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "It's really going to work." That night, they celebrated with a meal that used some of their hoarded supplies: real meat from the smokehouse, fresh bread, and even a jar of preserves Sarah had been saving for a special occasion. Michael chattered excitedly about all the things they could grow now, and Jake drew diagrams showing how they could irrigate the entire farm. "We'll need to be strategic about what we plant," he explained, sketching furrows and irrigation channels on a piece of brown paper. "Corn and wheat for staple crops, but also vegetables that will bring good prices in town, maybe even some fruit trees if we can find good stock." "Thomas always wanted apple trees," Sarah said softly. "He said someday we'd have an orchard that would shade the whole backyard. Then we'll plant apple trees," Jake said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Over the following days, they worked to properly line the well with the stones they'd removed, building a secure structure that would last for decades. Jake also began work on a more sophisticated irrigation system, using his knowledge of water flow and pressure to design channels that would carry water efficiently to every part of the farm. Sarah found herself watching him work with growing admiration. He approached each task with careful thought and meticulous attention to detail, but also with an obvious joy in the work itself. When he didn't know something, he admitted it freely and worked with her to find solutions. There was no false pride in him, no need to prove his superiority. Just honest competence and a willingness to learn. Michael had attached himself to Jake like a shadow, absorbing every bit of knowledge the man was willing to share. Sarah watched her son blossom under Jake's patient teaching, saw confidence returning to his thin shoulders and laughter to his voice. It had been so long since Michael had had a man's attention and guidance that she had forgotten how much he needed it. But it wasn't just Michael who was changing. Sarah could feel herself relaxing in ways she hadn't even realized she'd been tense. For months, every decision had been hers alone, every problem hers to solve, every burden hers to carry. Having someone to share the load was a relief so profound it sometimes brought her to tears. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Michael fell asleep between them, his head pillowed on Sarah's lap. Jake sat whittling a wooden toy horse for the boy, the shavings curling away from his knife in perfect spirals. "He's getting attached to you," Sarah observed quietly. "I'm getting attached to him too," Jake replied without looking up from his work. "Is that a problem?" "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "He's been hurt so much already. If this arrangement doesn't work out, it'll work out," Jake said with quiet confidence. "We'll make sure it does." Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. In the fading light, his face was peaceful in a way she hadn't seen before, as if some restless part of him had finally found a place to settle. "You really mean to stay, don't you?" she asked. "For as long as you'll have me," he replied, finally looking up to meet her eyes. "I know it's too soon to talk about permanent arrangements, but Sarah, I can see myself growing old on this land, working alongside you, watching Michael grow up, maybe adding to the family someday if God wills it." The last part was said so softly she almost didn't catch it, and it sent a flutter of something warm and frightening through her chest. "Jake, I know it's too early for such talk," he said quickly. "I'm not trying to rush you into anything, but I wanted you to know that my intentions are honorable, and that I'm thinking beyond just this harvest season." Sarah looked down at her sleeping son, then out at the fields that were already showing signs of recovery as Jake's irrigation channels began to work their magic. The future suddenly seemed full of possibilities she had thought were lost forever. "One step at a time," she said finally. "But Jake, I'm glad you're here." 3 weeks after they struck water, the first green shoots began to appear in the fields. Sarah stood at the edge of what had been a barren wasteland and watched tiny corn plants push through the dark soil, their leaves bright with new life. The sight filled her with a joy so profound it felt almost like worship. Jake appeared beside her, his hands dirty from working on the irrigation channels, his face bright with satisfaction. "Look at that," he said softly. 3 weeks ago, this was dead ground. Now look at it. "It's a miracle," Sarah breathed. "It's good soil, good water, and hard work," Jake corrected gently. "Though I suppose there might be a little divine intervention mixed in there too." The transformation of the farm was matched by changes in their daily routine. They rose before dawn to tend the irrigation channels and check the crops, worked through the heat of the day on various projects, and spent the evenings planning and preparing for the future. Jake had proven to be not just a skilled laborer but also a natural teacher, and Sarah found herself learning things about farming that Thomas had never thought to share with her. "Why didn't Thomas ever show me how to read the soil composition?" she asked one day as Jake demonstrated how to test for nutrient levels. "Most men of his generation believed farm work was men's work," Jake replied diplomatically. "They meant well, but they didn't understand that knowledge is power, regardless of who holds it." Sarah appreciated that he didn't criticize her late husband, even by implication. Thomas had been a good man, but he had also been a product of his time and upbringing. Jake, for reasons she didn't fully understand, saw things differently. As the crops continued to flourish, word began to spread among the scattered neighbors about the Henderson farm's miraculous recovery. Visitors started arriving to see the new well and irrigation system, and Jake fielded dozens of questions about water-finding techniques and well construction. "You should charge for consultations," Sarah suggested after a particularly long day of showing neighbors around the property. "Maybe," Jake said thoughtfully. "Though I'd want to be careful not to create competition for our own crops." "Our crops." The casual use of the possessive pronoun sent a warm flutter through Sarah's chest. Somewhere along the way, Jake had stopped being a helpful stranger and started being a true partner in every sense of the word. The change was noticed by others as well. Mrs. Crawford from the neighboring farm made pointed comments about unusual living arrangements, and Sarah overheard whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached. The gossip didn't surprise her, but it did sting. "People are talking," she told Jake one evening as they sat on the porch. "I know," he replied calmly. "Are you having second thoughts?" Sarah considered the question seriously. The gossip was unpleasant, but it was also irrelevant compared to the security and happiness she and Michael had found. "No," she said firmly, "but I think we need to make some decisions about the future. Either we make this arrangement official in some way, or I move on," Jake finished. "Sarah, I need you to know that I'm not staying here just for the farm or out of some misguided sense of duty. These past weeks, watching you work, seeing how you handle challenges, getting to know Michael, I've fallen in love with this life we're building together. More than that, I've fallen in love with you." The words hung in the evening air like a promise and a question all at once. Sarah felt her heart racing, her hands trembling slightly where they rested in her lap. "Jake, I know you're not ready to hear it," he continued gently, "and I'm not asking for an answer right now, but I wanted you to know where I stand, so you can make your decisions with complete information." Sarah rose from her chair and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the fields that were now lush with growing crops. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate widow with a dying farm and a frightened child. Now she had prosperity, security, and a future that stretched ahead filled with possibility. More than that, she had a man who saw her not as a burden to be managed but as a partner to be cherished. "I think," she said slowly, "that it's time we started talking about making this partnership permanent in every sense of the word." When she turned back, Jake was standing behind her, his eyes bright with hope and something deeper. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying that I love you too," Sarah said simply. "I'm saying that Michael needs a father, and I need a husband, and you seem admirably suited to both roles. I'm saying that if you're serious about staying, then maybe it's time we made it official." Jake's face broke into a grin that could have lit up the entire prairie. "Sarah Henderson, are you proposing to me?" "I believe I am," she replied with a laugh that felt like pure joy. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the parlor of their farmhouse, with Reverend Mackenzie from Cedar Falls officiating and most of their neighbors in attendance. Sarah wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered and freshened with new lace, while Jake wore a new suit ordered from the Montgomery Ward catalog. Michael served as ring-bearer, his face serious with the weight of his important duty. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when Jake kissed his new bride, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Even Mrs. Crawford, who had been the most vocal critic of their unusual arrangement, admitted that they made a handsome couple and that the boy clearly needed a father figure. The reception that followed showcased the bounty of their revitalized farm. Tables groaned under the weight of fresh vegetables, fruits, and grains, all grown with water from the well that had saved their lives and brought them together. Jake had also surprised Sarah with apple tree saplings, which they planted together the morning after the wedding, as a symbol of their commitment to building a future that would outlast them both. As autumn approached, their first harvest as a married couple exceeded all expectations. The corn stood tall and golden, heavy with kernels that would feed them through the winter and provide surplus for sale. The vegetable garden produced more than they could eat, and Sarah found herself preserving and canning with a joy she hadn't felt since before Thomas's death. Jake proved to be as skilled at business as he was at farming. He negotiated favorable prices for their crops in Cedar Falls, and even secured contracts with merchants in larger towns who were impressed by the quality of their produce. By October, they had not only recovered from their near disaster, but had achieved a level of prosperity that Thomas had only dreamed of. "Next year we'll expand the orchard," Jake announced one evening as they reviewed their accounts by lamplight. "And I've been thinking about adding some livestock, maybe a few head of cattle, definitely more chickens, and a pig," Michael added from where he was doing his arithmetic homework at the kitchen table. "Every farm needs a good pig. The boy's got a point," Jake said with a grin, ruffling Michael's hair. "Can't be a proper farm without a pig." Sarah smiled at the easy affection between her husband and son. Jake had stepped into the role of father with natural grace, firm when discipline was needed but generous with praise and encouragement. Michael had blossomed under his guidance, growing taller and more confident with each passing day. But perhaps the most profound change was in Sarah herself. The constant worry and fear that had been her companions for so long had melted away, replaced by a deep contentment and growing confidence in her own abilities. Jake had not only provided security but had also helped her discover strength she hadn't known she possessed. One crisp November morning, as they walked through the fields checking on the winter wheat they had planted, Sarah paused to look back at their house. Smoke curled from the chimney. The new well stood strong and proud beside the old oak tree, and the bare branches of their young apple trees reached toward the sky like promises of springs to come. "What are you thinking about?" Jake asked, following her gaze. "About how different everything is from a year ago," Sarah replied. "About how close we came to losing everything, and how a single act of kindness changed the course of our lives." "Your kindness, you mean?" Jake said softly. "If you hadn't been brave enough to accept help from a stranger, if you hadn't had the courage to trust me with your future." "Our kindness," Sarah corrected, slipping her hand into his. "We saved each other, Jake. You gave me the tools to save my farm, and I gave you a reason to stop running." As they stood there in the peaceful morning light, a rider appeared on the horizon, just as Jake had appeared all those months ago. But this time, Sarah felt no fear, only curiosity. Their well was deep and true, their marriage was strong, and their future was secure. Whatever challenges might come, they would face them together. The rider proved to be a young man named David Turner, dust-covered and desperate, leading a wagon containing his pregnant wife and their 2 small children. His story was achingly familiar. Failed crops, a dried-up well, and the crushing weight of trying to hold a family together against impossible odds. "I heard in town that you folks found water when everyone said it couldn't be done," he said to Jake, his voice raw with exhaustion and hope. "I was wondering, that is, if you could spare some water for my family, and maybe some advice." Sarah and Jake exchanged a look that held an entire conversation. Without hesitation, Sarah stepped forward. "Of course. Bring your family inside, and we'll get them fed and rested. Jake can look at your land situation." What followed was a familiar pattern that would repeat many times over the years to come. Jake spent 3 days helping David locate a promising spot for a well on his property, teaching him the techniques of reading water signs and proper digging methods. Sarah tended to his exhausted wife and helped deliver her baby when labor came unexpectedly early. As the Turner family prepared to leave with renewed hope and practical knowledge, David pressed a small leather pouch into Jake's hands. "It's not much, but it's all we can spare right now. When our well comes in and our crops recover, there'll be more." Jake hefted the pouch, feeling the weight of coins inside, then handed it back with a gentle smile. "Keep it. You'll need every penny to get your operation running. But when you're prosperous again, remember to help the next family that comes along in desperate straits." "I will," David promised solemnly. "I surely will." As they watched the Turner wagon disappear into the distance, Sarah slipped her arm around Jake's waist. "You do realize we're going to have a steady stream of visitors now, don't you? Word spreads fast out here." "I'm counting on it," Jake replied. "This territory needs more than just surviving farms. It needs thriving communities. Every family we help makes the whole region stronger." Over the following years, their farm became known throughout Kansas and beyond as a place where desperate families could find not just water, but hope. Jake's reputation as a water finder spread, and he was called upon to consult on wells from Colorado to Missouri. But he never stayed away long, always returning to Sarah and Michael and the land that had become the center of his world. Michael grew into a tall, capable young man who inherited his stepfather's skill with water finding and his mother's iron determination. He married young Emma Crawford, the daughter of their former critic, and built his own farm just 2 miles away from the original homestead. Sarah bore 2 more children, a daughter they named Anna, in memory of Jake's first wife, and a son they called Thomas to honor her first husband. The apple orchard grew into a local landmark, providing shade for countless family gatherings and fruit for 3 counties. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat in the shade of those same apple trees watching their grandchildren play by the old well, Sarah reflected on the miraculous chain of events that had brought them together. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come along that day?" she asked Jake, who was now silver-haired but still strong from a lifetime of honest work. "No," he replied simply, "because I don't believe it was chance that brought me here. I think it was providence, pure and simple. 2 people who needed healing, finding exactly what they needed in each other." "And the well?" Sarah teased. "Was that providence too?" Jake chuckled, pulling her closer to his side. "The well was just good sense and hard work. But the love," He looked into her eyes with the same warmth that had first captured her heart all those years ago. The love was definitely a miracle. As the sun set over their prosperous fields, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah Henderson, Morrison, knew that Jake was right. Water had saved their farm, but love had saved their souls. And in the morning, there would be more work to do, more families to help, more dreams to nurture into reality. The well of second chances had proved to be deeper and more generous than either of them had ever dared to imagine, providing not just water for their crops, but a spring of hope that would flow through generations yet to come.